Good morning. I'm Gord Long with the Financial Repression Authority. It's my pleasure to have with me this morning Adam Taggart. He's the president and co-founder of Peak Prosperity. Good morning, Adam.
Good morning, Gordon. How are you?
Well, just fine, and a happy new year to you.
Thank you. Same to you.
Now, we're here this morning to talk about Adam's latest book, co-authored with Chris Martenson. It's entitled Prosper, How to Prepare for the Future and Create a World Worth Inheriting. It's the sequel to the Crash Course. And Adam, I thought the way we would begin is, could you give our listeners an overview of your background and make them familiar with Peak Prosperity?
Sure. So, as for myself, I graduated college and went straight to Wall Street. This was back in the early to mid 90s, and spent a few years as an investment banking analyst on Wall Street. Being completely honest, hated every moment of it. Just wasn't for me from a cultural standpoint. But it really gave me a front row seat to how the interests of Wall Street were very misaligned with the clientele that they served. It really was from my perspective, from the inside, a wealth transfer machine more than a wealth creation machine. At least the wealth it was creating was for the banks themselves. At least that was the wealth they cared about creating. So ended up leaving Wall Street, went to Stanford Business School to get my MBA there. The internet revolution happened while I was there. So it was very hard not to jump on into that when I graduated, which is what I did. I joined a startup that eventually got sold and then worked for Yahoo for the better part of a decade. And during my time at Yahoo, I'll try to make this the 60-second version, but went to buy a house. My wife and I had just started a family, and went to buy a house that was probably built back in the 1970s, starter home, plain vanilla, tiny little house. Nothing had been done to it since it had been built, and was advised to bid $100,000 over asking for that house. I think a total price of close to $900,000. Didn't feel right to me, but I did it anyways, and I was so far outbid I wasn't even invited to counter. And so that happened one more time, and I was living out in Silicon Valley at the time, where it's crazy out here, real estate price wise, and thought to myself, you know what? I'm not understanding why people are willing to pay so much for housing. So I went online, tried just to find out what I was missing, and found myself gravitating to a small number of voices. But what was interesting is these voices were the only ones who had data, and they were warning about a housing asset bubble. And as I learned more about that, I realized it was due to poor economic policy that was creating malinvestment that was leading to the housing bubble, and began finding more and more experts to listen to. One of those experts was Chris Martenson, who had his Crash Course series coming out right about that time. Well, flash forward a couple years, the 2008 credit crisis hit, the housing bubble burst. Those small number of voices had been validated by market events. And I just began feeling like what I was doing at Yahoo was just not relevant to the type of future that I saw coming. So I started looking for something else to do, something that I felt was more worthy of my time and something the world needed more, and centered around financial education, really building awareness of these big trends that were in play so that people could take prudent steps now to position themselves smartly. And around that time, got to know Chris, and we decided that the finger that the movement that he had his finger in, and my digital media expertise might actually be a really good complement of skills. And so we came together and founded Peak Prosperity, which is a site that's dedicated to exactly what I was looking to do, which is to help people understand really what the true game that's going on is, to understand the rules by which it's being played, and to understand what its likely end results are going to be, and then help people answer the question, well, what steps should I be taking now as an individual to make sure that as these trends manifest in force, that A, I'm protected against them, and B, that maybe I'm actually positioned to prosper if I'm smart about it. So that's kind of the short story of...
It's fascinating. I was with Motorola outside of the United States, and we acquired a company in the Silicon Valley in the early 90s, and they asked me to come to America and move out as part of the takeover. And so I flew out there. I spent one day looking at the housing, listening to housing prices and looking, and I flew back and I said, no, sir. So they said, well, they come to Boston. I went to Boston and they said, this is nosebleed, but at least like I might be able to afford a house here. And that was at the time when we were a huge technology center in Boston, and the Silicon Valley. But it's quite a difference in the change in the prices, and they've only got higher at least in the Silicon Valley. But anyway, I don't want to get us off track, but I relate with what you were saying. What, Adam? This is your second book, as I mentioned earlier, with Chris. What prompted you to write this book? What was the real driving force behind it?
Great. Great question. So you're right. There was a book written earlier, which is the Crash Course. It's in book form. It's also a 4.5-hour series of video chapters you can watch for free online. And just to be clear, I didn't write this. This was written by Chris. I did help with the editing of it, but it's largely Chris's work. And the Crash Course basically is what we consider to be our best attempt at really helping people understand those macro trends that are in play. And we look at those notably across 3 different systems that are important in and of themselves, but it's their interconnection where we see the real significance. And that's the economy, it's our energy systems, and it's the environment. And I won't go into detail in them here because I know you've had Chris on before, and your listeners can go watch the Crash Course videos or may already have. But the key trend that we point out for folks is that all these forces that we focus on, the thing they all have in common is that they're unsustainable. And that essentially the world as it works and as we know it is largely not going to be able to continue the way that it has been for a variety of reasons, but it's largely the ending of these unsustainable trends. And so people watch the Crash Course videos, they read the book, etc. Usually they get, kind of nervous and they get kind of spun up around the logic and really just the clear math behind what we talk about. And the number one question we get from people is, well, gosh, if that's what the future is going to be defined by, well, then what should I do? And you mentioned earlier that it's crazy how the housing price success in Silicon Valley, and I'm assuming the same is probably true in the Boston area these days too, but how quickly it returned to and then exceeded the excesses of the housing bubble that was building pre-1997. And so that's not just happening in housing, it's happening with all sorts of asset classes around the world, and that's largely due to the trillions and trillions of thin air, printed money and liquidity that the world central banks have pumped into the world. So we feel that the time is more significant than ever for this type of what should I do guidebook, because we're at a point right now where we fell from a certain height in 2008, and I think most of your listeners remember how painful that was. Well, we're at much higher heights in many other areas right now, and none of the fundamental causes of the 2008 crisis have been resolved or satisfactorily addressed. So if we fell from, say, halfway up the ladder back in 2008, we think we're now several rungs higher than that, and the fall is going to be that much faster, and it's going to hurt that much more when we land this next time. So we really want people to be taking prudent action now before a major correction, because everybody wants to buy insurance after their house is burned down, but it's too late then, right? So if we can get you to take smart steps now, you'll hopefully be able to avoid most of the pain that may be coming.
The degree of leverage on a global basis is so significantly larger than it was in 2008. And I happen to live through the 86 crash, 2000, 2007, and this one's even worrying me more. And it's coming. I don't know when. But this is unsustainable. And that something is going to trigger it, in my humble opinion. And some level of insurance and protection is the most prudent thing you can do. And let's hope it doesn't happen. But insurance is something you should give a lot of thought to in advance, right?
Exactly.
So it's absolutely critical. Now, what is the real key message in this particular book?
Great question. The key message is to develop resilience. It's a word that I think is beginning to become slightly more prevalent in the consciousness of concerned-minded people, the sort that you and I talk to, Gordon. For us in particular, we really look at it as the ability to bounce back from an insult, right? So the ability to be, as, if you will, as least changed as possible by a change in your environment and be able to react to it and kind of get back to where you were, where you want to be. So that's sort of the vector that we ask people to, to focus on, which is, what are all the ways that no matter what happens in the future, because we have a pretty good idea of where things are going to end up, and we certainly know where we are right now. What's pretty darn hard to know is the path we're going to take to get from here to there, and we certainly have an assessment based upon probabilities and what we think is most likely to happen. But even then, the timing of it all is almost impossible to predict. As you mentioned, there's a trigger out there, but we can debate all day long what that trigger or cluster of triggers might be. And there's the whole concept of your local mileage may vary. So, if there's another financial shock, well, that's not going to be felt equally across all parts of the country. If there's another real estate correction, that's certainly going to be dependent upon where you live in terms of how vicious that's going to be. So, because a lot of this is unknowable, what you want to do is you want to make investments today that are going to protect you against the greatest risks and the most likely risks, and basically give you options so that if a curveball gets thrown your way that you haven't deliberately planned for, you've got some other investments that might kick in and to protect that. And I'll talk about what I mean by that in just a moment. In the book itself, we talk about the importance of developing resilience and generally how people can get in the right mindset and how they should be thinking of it. But we use this framework that we borrowed from the School of Permaculture. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with permaculture, but it started initially as a way to do landscape/garden design where you are essentially using nature to do your work for you. You're looking at what are the things that nature by itself wants to have happen with this land, and then how do you take what nature wants to do and put it to work for you? We find that it's a discipline and a school of thought that can be scaled to many other things beyond just living systems out in nature. Anyways, the permaculturalists that we took our inspiration from, they have this framework called the 8 forms of capital. So these 8 forms of capital really are what we encourage people to look to investing in order to develop true wealth. And what's interesting is when we tell people to develop resilience and to invest in capital, of course, everybody's mind goes to financial capital, to money. And we realize that when people are asking us, hey, what should I do? They really mean, what should I do with my money? And that's because we all have wallets. We're all working hard to create financial futures for ourselves and for the ones we care about. And usually we start there. Because that's, again, what people are most acutely interested in. But then we really encourage people to look across the other 7 forms of capital. And I'll quickly list off what they are, and then maybe we can talk maybe just a little bit about each one.
Yeah, could we? I think they're very informative.
Great, thank you. So there's financial capital, as I mentioned. Then there's living capital. There's material capital. There's social capital, emotional capital, knowledge capital, cultural capital, and time capital. And essentially what we recommend people do is that they look across all those areas and look where they have abundance and look where they have deficits, and to encourage them to, prioritize their time in shoring up the deficits rather than just continuing to put all of their focus into maybe perhaps 1 or 2 of these buckets. And what's important to know about this whole concept of developing resilience and these different 8 forms of capital is a couple of things. One is you are able to exchange capital from one form to another. And why this is important is a lot of people will say, well, look, I don't have a lot of money, and so I can't do all this other stuff because I don't have enough disposable income. And the answer is well, there's a lot of different ways in which you can exchange these capital one area for another one in which you're deficient to one where you want to have more. And so that could be exchanging money. So, for example, material capital really is sort of the physical, tangible things that we want. These might be tools, they might be solar panels for your house, etc. And sure, you can buy those with money. Money is financial capital really is an easy way to, or a mechanism to exchange for material capital. But let's say I need a shovel. Well, I could go to the hardware store and I could hand over some money. I could exchange financial capital for that shovel. Or I could go over to my neighbor's house and say, hey, got a project I can help you out with? Maybe you need somebody to pick up your kids from school this week while you're busy doing something else. And you can exchange your social capital or your time capital to get access to that neighbor's shovel to do whatever you need to do with it. So I'm mentioning this up front only because it's important to realize that this framework will work for everybody, regardless of their socioeconomic condition. Like I said earlier, we have a lot of people who sort of defeat themselves right at the beginning by just saying, well, I don't have enough money to do that, and kind of write off the rest. That's completely and utterly the wrong way to be thinking about this. Secondly, and I'll reiterate this at the end of the discussion, but what we feel is so important about the steps that we recommend people take in building capital across all of these areas is these are great investments of your time and energy and resources, no matter what the future brings. So you are never going to look back and regret and following these steps and say, gosh, you know what? I really regret getting healthier. I really regret forming tighter bonds with my neighbors and the people in my community. I really regret being a good steward of my money and growing it over time, right? These are all things that are life enhancing. So even if we're completely wrong, there's still great things to be doing. Now, if we're right, the protective and prospering benefits of these steps take on an outsized impact because you're going to be, positioning yourselves very, very advantageously against the future changes that we think are coming. So it's really important at the beginning of this process to realize, look, even if we've got the timing right, even if the rest of our lives looks and feels pretty much like it has up to now, these are just good things to be doing. And of course, to your insurance point, that insurance option value really kicks in if we actually turn out to be right. Mm-hmm. Right? So very briefly, we can maybe dial through each of these. Financial capital,
is the autonomy and individuality that can come with real freedom by exchanging these various forms of capital. And I'll give you an example. I have a European background. My wife in her town that she's from in Austria, up in the Alps. What happens up there is they live in beautiful homes, and I wonder how can they possibly afford them? And they're twice the size of ours, and I had a corporate job, and things were great, and they have everything. I said, how do you do it? And they said, well, it took us 11 years. And I said, 11 years to save up. No, we didn't say it. We they don't have a mortgage. They didn't save up to buy this home. And what they do is standard practice is the moment you start to think about getting married, you get a little piece of land that it comes with the family, or you save for this piece of land, and then you start the process. And so you have to put in a foundation. Well, one of your friends or in your social network or one of your cousins does the foundation, and you pay him for the actual physical things that need to be bought, concrete, for example. And then they go to the next stage. So they're both working and they're staying at their parents, and eventually they build a house. And so electrical, roofing, power, electrical, etc. All those things go in stages. So at the end of it, they owe no money. They're living in a beautiful home, no debt. But of course, all those years they had a skill that they were working on weekends on somebody else's house. Okay. And you say, well, that's a great financial solution and social, but it was more than that, because what I saw was that working together created such a community where everybody knew each other, trusted each other, had invested in each other, so that when we were there for weddings, the weddings were like the whole town was there, the whole area was there, and you could feel the friendship. And it springs more than just the house, because all of a sudden there's much more sharing that goes on and helping in times of need and times of grief. And they went through crisis of the Second World War. They were invaded by Russia. They were part of the Russian sector. I can go on about living in crisis. And none of them talk about that, because through all these generations, they had autonomy. Does that make sense to you? And that's the way people in many places of the world live. And they look at me and when I talk about North America, they don't understand what I'm talking about.
That's a wonderful example. I'm so glad you brought it up. And you're completely right. And it's a great example of like I was sort of ticking off all the different types of capital that we talk about there, whether it's cultural capital, social capital, knowledge capital, what's the skill that you're bringing, right? Your time capital. It's a great example of how those all come together in a way that benefits everybody. You're
The whole community
the
benefits.
whole community there, exactly. Yeah. And what's so funny about that too is you know, so culturally, right? That's the culture there, and it works and has a lot of value for that culture and a lot of appeal to us. It's probably not that different from culturally what things were like back in America, probably 100+ years ago in small communities, right?
I think so. I think if we
Yeah,
went
and
back to the end 1800s, maybe the early 1900s, it was the same thing. I
yeah,
suspect.
and I think a lot of what we talk about are things that your like grandparents or great grandparents probably would have recognized that we've really, lost culturally over the past couple of generations. Contrast that to now where, you're just sort of pushed out of the nest and expected to go up to your eyeballs in debt for a mortgage and buy some house in suburbia where you don't know your neighbors, right? And contrast that with how that suburban community of basically strangers is going to react in some time of crisis. You mentioned how this town went through World War II, right? We also find a lot of people who sort of dream about expatriating and moving to another country, that leaving the ills of the U.S. behind. As you know, a lot of the problems that we're talking about are global in scope, and we think that people oftentimes do a little too much over romanticizing, and when they plop themselves down into a community that's very tight knit like that, and you're the outsider who didn't grow up there, who didn't participate in that fabric building of the community, over 11 years or whatever of helping other people build their own homes, and you're the stranger who's just kind of parachuted into their world. If times become tight there, are you the guy they're going to be looking out for and have their back? Certainly not as much as they're going to have for the folks that they already know that they grew up with, right? So it's investing in that community and applying it over time is where the value comes, right? It's not something that you can just buy. And a lot of people think they can kind of buy themselves into a community aspect of it.
No,
You really can't, right? And so that's why developing this type of capital, these other forms of capital on your own, are important, because many of them, like social capital, take time. You have to prove it over time.
because it's about trust and these old words called integrity, values, morality. I mean, I don't mean character. Really means something, because people's word is their bond, and it's very precious. It's very precious to them. So and because we become quickly, my observations, experience with this, we become debt slaves right out of college, and so we're into what is my credit score, and I ask them, they don't even know what credit is. One little bank, if we don't have it, we don't buy it. So it's like, I don't understand. If you don't have it, why I have to wait until I earn it or I can trade for it. So
What point culturally did we get to the point in the West here where living within your means seemed like a crazy thing to do? I mean, it's now the exception versus the rule, right? Just to your point, we're encouraged and enabled to pay for as much as possible with as much credit as we can get on possible, and live a grandiose life and aspire to the lives of spendthrift celebrities and whatnot. Culturally, it's the rare person that has learned to live within their means. As a matter of fact,
well,
in the book,
there's so much peer pressure on people if they were to do that. It's almost like they're
oh,
rejected,
totally.
like there's something wrong with it. So it's the materialism that we all know about, and becoming a 70% consumption economy. If we can comprehend being a 70% consumption, which destroys your ability to create capital and make
Right.
investment because it's all being consumed, puts us into such a position that we enslave ourselves without knowing it. We become the bondage. And the point I'm trying to make is independence is the most precious thing you can have in life. In times of crisis, where you've got that flexibility.
We couldn't agree more, and I think the point I was making that probably really resonated here with you is you're able to use all these other forms of capital and deploy them to get the things that you want in life, to have the things you want in life. And some of them are very tangible. It might be like an electrical system for the house you're building for your new wife, if you're growing up in this small little town. But it might be something a little less tangible, but no less important, like a network of family and friends that will come support you in a time of need, or your own health. One of the things that uh, totally gets underinvested in, certainly in Western culture, is the living systems that we depend on, and those are, the food sheds around us in our local communities, our watersheds, but it's also our own bodies. And if you look at the modern American diet, if you look at the modern American healthcare system, we are dying essentially of what's increasingly referred to as diabetes, which is largely based upon poor lifestyle choices. I mean, these are things that are eminently avoidable. We're just poorly educated, and we're poorly incented to live with the discipline that's actually going to result in good health for us, which of course enables so many other things for us. But it's just one more example where our culture and our society is not serving us well, and we need to basically take our futures into our own hands. But having the freedom of actually having a body that's free from illness and sickness, that's fit and capable of doing more things, having the freedom to get what you want without having to spend money, right? Because you're able to do it based upon trust, based upon the times you're going to be there for other people. The freedom of having the emotional stability to deal with change and not live in fear of basically being destroyed if things don't go exactly the way that you want them to be. All of these things, to your point, really come down to a manifestation of personal freedom at some point.
Exactly, and it's sad how cultures can shift, and if they get too far off, all these lessons that have created cultures over thousands of years, what really works, we may be straying from it. And it's only when you go and see a culture that's solid you realize how far we're straying. And I'm referring to materialism, consumption. You mentioned diabetes is now at epidemic proportion because of obesity, and so we think healthcare is about health coverage. No, healthcare is not about health coverage. It's about
Right.
health, taking care of yourself. That's where it starts, not whether you have medical coverage. I'm not poo-pooing that, but that's where it starts. Adam, your book is definitely something that I personally say nobody's talking about. These are so core to your thinking and framing that I'm surprised more aren't writing about it. So I compliment you on that. What have you learned
I
since?
just said
Sorry,
thank you very much.
what have you learned since writing a book that has reinforced this? Anything?
Sure. I think it's really the point that you just mentioned. So Chris and I don't posture that there's anything in this book that is never been thought of in the history of man. It's not everything that's in there. Largely, when people read it, say, "Gosh, this is just common sense." And I think the value that we brought to the table here is distilling it all down into one more or less comprehensive guide that offers a lot of really cogent step-by-step guidance that people can follow. But it's been the reaction to the book that surprised me the most, where it's very much kind of been like rain on the dry desert sand, where there are so many people out there that are, well, first off, there's so many people out there that are ignoring the problem, right? And those are not your listeners. People like your listeners are people who are intelligent, curious-minded folks who are trying to figure out for themselves what the future is going to be like. There are plenty of people out there, yourself, ourselves, and many of our peers who, for now 10 plus years, have been talking about the problems and predicaments we face. And it's very important that we understand what's going on out there. But to a certain extent, you get a little bit saturated with, the dark, depressing story of what's coming, and you kind of, feel like, okay, I got enough about what the problem is. I sort of understand most of it. What I now need are solutions, and there aren't that many people that are presenting solutions out there in the solution space, or maybe talking about it in the way that I think you and I are right now, Gordon. There's a lot of individual people, like people that have an individual part of the solution out there. It's very, very important. And if there's anything that I think this book, and here it is right here, Prosper, does well, is it sort of brings all those together in one area where you can look at it and sort of see them as a whole and see them as a string of solutions that you can then put together and customize based upon your own personal needs into something that's actually going to be a plan for you for the future. And I think it's that ability to have a plan to step forward into the future with confidence and with optimism is that people have been really hungry for that. And so being able to put a solution like this in their hands has been very, very well received. And I don't pretend that this is the only solution that's out there, and I hope more people begin really focusing and talking more about this solution set that you and I are beginning to define here. But I think if anything that I could say to folks like you and me who are in this space of educating people is I think we need to be a little bit more proactive about challenging ourselves to provide more actual solution guidance for people, because that's what the market very clearly seems to want right now.
Exactly. You said there's nothing in the book that isn't common sense, but it reminds me of Will Rogers said the most uncommon thing he found is common
It's
sense.
true.
And it's very true. We have to break now. Is there one last thought you'd like to leave with our?
I think it's just a reinforcement of anybody can do these steps. These steps are good things to take, even if we're completely wrong about the timeline of when the unsustainable trends are going to eventually matter. You're never going to regret taking the types of steps that this book puts down. The other thing I'd leave them with, too, is one of the biggest challenges that we hear from our readers at Peak Prosperity is they understand this material, but they desperately want their loved ones to sort of see through the same lens and to care in the same way that they do about taking steps today to secure a better future. We wrote this book in mind to be shared with those types of people. So it's not nearly as data rich or chart heavy or you could say doom and gloomy as the Crash Course was or similar works. This one's really designed to be shared with the average person. So it doesn't scare them too much. It does give them enough of the dark math to catch their attention, but it really shows people that there's a lot of stuff we need to do, but if we do it, we can step forward into a future that in very many ways is a better one than we have today. You know, you were just talking about how that community in Europe worked. Those social ties, the ability to afford, you know, a nice house over time that you're going to raise your family in. There's a whole set of benefits that come from the sort of return to older values, to integrity that you were saying earlier. So if you're looking to engage the people you care about with this type of material, you know, feel free to consider Prosper as something to consider putting in their hands. And if that's something you want to do, you can go to peakprosperity.com/prosper, and you'll find information about the book and where to get it. If you don't remember the URL, it's available on Amazon and virtually any other bookseller of your choice. We have it available as a print book. We know a lot of people like to read on their Kindles and electric book reading devices. We have an ebook version of it, and we know a lot of people like to listen audibly when they're driving to work or maybe working out in the garden. We have an audio version as well. So if you go to peakprosperity.com/prosper, you'll find your way to any one of those different versions of the book.
Adam, thanks for the time. Great discussion. Very much enjoyed it. And all the best with the success of this book. And I say that not just for you, but for society overall. I think the more people build their plans on a foundation of a right kind of philosophy, the more secure they really will be. And it isn't just about financial security in a time of crisis. There's a lot more to it than just money. And if you've ever been in a state of crisis, you will know that very quickly. It's who your friends are and who you can trust and who you can rely on. So with that, all the best in the new year, and we'll have to talk to you again.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Gordon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.